Hello, my name is Emma, and today I'm going to be telling you guys my mental illness story. As today ends my week-long spree of mental health-themed videos for Mental Illness Awareness Week, I thought I would go out with a bang and tell you guys a little bit more about my journey with mental illness and my recovery. So this video is going to be very long, so there's no need for a lengthy intro, and we're just going to jump right into it. So the earliest I can really date back to my mental illness starting was when I was 11 years old. 6th grade is when I first remember starting to think that there was something wrong with my body, that I wasn't comfortable in the skin that I was in, that I was too fat or too big, and that I needed to change that about myself. Let me preface this by saying that for my entire life, up until I actually joined recovery for my eating disorder, I was underweight. So it was never that I actually needed to lose weight, I probably needed to gain weight. So all of this time, it is like clear-cut, total distorted body image. And I feel like part of that reason is why, no matter how hard I try, I can never find a clear-cut reason as to why I started developing a mental illness. I was just one of the people that was unlucky and got touched by it, but there was never like a traumatic event that like resulted in me wanting to harm myself or wanting to restrict my food. It was just kind of on me. Honestly, the only things I can really think of is, firstly, I was a dancer. I've been dancing since I was 2 years old. I still dance today. So when I was younger, I always wanted to be a professional dancer. That was like my career goal. And of course, when you think about ballerinas, you think about very slim figures. So that stereotype might have played into it a little bit. As for food when I was younger, I grew up in a household where my mom never really ate anything. It wasn't that she had an eating disorder or that it was really intentional. It was just always like she wasn't hungry ever. For as long as I can remember, my sister has been a health nut. She's always been working out, always been eating healthy. And my dad loves junk food. I never really cared about nutrition. And so I guess these three conflicting versions of what food and nutrition and diet should really be were totally different. That might have played a role in it, but I can't say for sure. So when I was in 6th grade, that's when I first started really feeling like I was fat. And whenever I looked in the mirror, all I saw was the fat on my body, and I could never really see past that, despite the fact that in elementary school, people used to call me Twiggy because I was so thin. It really was just the way I was personally viewing myself. And in 6th grade, I didn't really understand what dieting was. I mean, that's my first memory of learning about the food pyramid was in 6th grade. So it was just learning what nutrition is. So when I would diet, I would really just like eat a lot of nothing or whatever I really wanted. There were days where I would eat nothing. There were days when I would only eat 100-calorie packs, and that was the only thing I would let into my body. And there were days where I didn't care. And so all throughout my life, my mental illness has kind of come in like a wave is the way I always describe it. There are points in my life where it really hits me hard, and then there are points where it doesn't affect me at all, and then sometimes it goes up more and then it goes down. So it was never like from 11 years old I was constantly suffering. After 6th grade, I had gone into middle school, and so from there my eating disorder wasn't affecting me as badly as it was before. I wasn't having as many thoughts despite them being there sometimes. What really took over in middle school was my depression. Again, nothing traumatic happened to me. I had a very happy childhood. It just happened out of nowhere. I just started becoming very sad and lonely. It was so long ago, and my depression has developed so much since then that it's hard for me to even remember what I was really sad about. I just remember so many nights of feeling lonely and feeling like my life was hopeless and that it didn't matter and there was no point in me going on to be an adult, because if I can't handle life at 13, how can I handle life at 25? I started self-harming at 13, and my self-harm history was never exclusive to one thing. It wasn't like I always used a razor. Any form of self-harm I could get my hands on was what I would use to kind of get that emotional release. I would cut myself with a razor or with a knife. I would snap rubber bands on my wrist. I would use push pins to scratch up my arm. I would scratch my arm with my hand. I even remember using keys to cut my arm in class one day. I was sitting in class and I was so overwhelmed that I took out my house keys and would self-harm with it. Another thing I remember specifically doing a lot for a really long time is when I would be doing my homework, I would burn my feet on the heater, would turn the heater all the way up, and I would just put my bare feet on it, and I would just have burn marks on my feet, and it would hurt for days and days and days. The thing about self-harm is you do it because you want to take all of that internal pain and turn it into external pain, and hopefully that'll make it go away, but it never does. You feel good for about 5 seconds, and then as soon as it's over, you're feeling terrible again, not only because of what's actually affecting you, but because you just tried to deal with it in that way. I also started engaging in this thing called parasuicide, which I actually didn't learn until I started studying psychology. Parasuicide is kind of like a middle ground between self-harm and actually committing suicide, because with self-harm, you just want to get the emotional release out. A lot of the times it's not an actual suicide attempt, and suicide, obviously, you're actually trying to end your own life. Parasuicide is a suicidal gesture, and so the one that I used to enact in most most would be taking pills. I wouldn't take pills to get high, and I wouldn't take pills to overdose. Just the act of taking any pill, no matter what it was, I would take a bunch, and like that would make me feel better. There wasn't really a point to it. It was just kind of the same feeling of self-harming where like for a second after taking a bunch of pills, I felt better, and then 10 seconds later I was freaking out thinking I was going to die and I had taken too many. Luckily, I never had any really serious run-ins with that. There was one time when my mom caught me and had to call poison control because I took too many like sleeping pills or whatever it was, but I was totally fine, and that has definitely been a thing of the past, and I haven't really done that for a couple of years. So my middle school years was really where my depression and self-harming attitudes really started, but for the life of me, I can't remember what it was that made me so sad and made me feel like there was no point in living in this world. I distinctly remember when I was 13 years old, I made a promise to kill myself before my 16th birthday because I thought 16 would be the perfect time to die. You know, I got to live out my teenage years and I would be able to mature a little bit, but I wouldn't have to deal with all of the effects of graduating and going to college and getting a job and getting married and having kids. I was just so terrified of the future that I thought the way to prevent that fear and, you know, prevent all of that failure was to end my own life. So that was something that stuck with me for a really, really long time. And then as the wave was at its tippy top, it went back down again, and I started my freshman year of high school, which was actually extremely enjoyable, and really none of my mental illness plagued me that first year for the most part. But the turning point of that was kind of like May or June 2011. The feelings I was developing started out very, very innocently. It was summer, I wanted to have a good beach body, and so I just decided to start changing up my diet and making it a little healthier. I started out with extremely normal things like incorporating more fruits and vegetables, which was something I never ate as a kid. I had cut out junk food and I was drinking more water and tea than soda, and honestly, I was doing really good, and it's kind of like what you aim for when you want to start a diet. But very, very quickly, things went really, really wrong. And honestly, this escalated so quickly that it's hard for me to do anything but just jump from that healthy eating habits to my extremely disordered eating habits. I do remember the first drastic thing I did was I cut meat out of my diet. I became a vegetarian, and it wasn't for ethical reasons like most people do. I thought that meat was unnecessary and all it was doing was pouring more fat and calories into my body, and so I cut it out and went totally vegetarian. Very quickly, I was taking more and more stuff out of my diet to the point where I wouldn't drink anything if it wasn't water or green tea. I completely cut out junk food, and I was starting to replace things that I used to love eating with things I actually didn't like because I thought they had less calories. I started exercising, which another really, really great thing that I had never done before that is super good for you, but again, it got really, really intense before I could even recognize what was happening. So I feel like the best way to get you guys to understand how insane things really got was to just take you through a typical day in my life that summer. So I'd wake up at 6 a.m. and immediately I would go out and I would run a mile. I would come home and take the absolute most freezing cold shower you could even imagine. And I know that cold showers during the summer are a great thing, but I had read somewhere that when your body is cold, it burns more calories trying to warm it up. So it was only cold showers for me no matter what the weather was. I would start getting ready, and my breakfast would be a cup of green tea with 0-calorie sweetener, and that is it. I obviously had cut out breakfast entirely, which as many of you know is super unhealthy and not good for you. And so even though I know that breakfast is the most important meal of the day, it was just extra calories I thought I could live without. So I didn't consume them. Over the summer, the elementary schools in my district would have a day camp for children to go to, and so from like 9 to 2, I would basically be a counselor all day. So even though my mom and my sister both worked at the same camp and both drove their cars, I would get there on my own, whether that would be running, walking, or biking, and it was at least 1.5 miles every morning for me to get there. I would get to camp, and although arts and crafts and doing things like that were like the hot thing for girls to do at camp, I would make everyone go outside as much as I could possibly get them just so I could have a little bit more exercise no matter what it was. At the start of camp, I would usually bring a snack, and then for lunch, I would basically have a salad with like lettuce, croutons, sometimes tofu, almonds, and dressing. But very quickly that diminished down to nothing, and most days I was eating a handful of Cheerios, and I think my number was like 6 radishes because radishes were my safe food. That was it for lunch. And then after camp, I would go home and I would either bike home, I would run home, I would walk home, whatever I had done that previous morning. I would get home, change out of my camp clothes, and then I would go and either go for a run or for a bike ride. After I had done that bout of exercising, I would come home and I would eat dinner. And so dinner was basically the biggest amount of calories I would consume in a day because I knew that I couldn't avoid sitting with my family. I was very afraid of my family figuring out what I was going through through and forcing you to eat. So even though I would spend most of my mornings not eating anything, I would have to sit down at dinner and consume as little as I possibly could manage so that they wouldn't find out. I would do a lot of different things so that it looked like I had eaten more, whether it would be cutting up a lot of food or pushing it under the table, putting it under napkins, or even hiding it in my clothes. After dinner, I would go out and exercise again, which meant either a bike ride or a run. Whichever I didn't do before dinner, I would do after. Throughout those 2 exercise periods, on a good day, I could probably run 10 miles, come home for dinner, and then bike 15, which is a lot. If you don't know how exercise works, that's not normal. I would come home from that late at night. I'd probably spend a little bit of time on the computer or whatnot, and then I would go in my room and I'd work out using Wii Fit until 2 in the morning. Then I would wake up at 6 in the morning and do it all again. That was my life. That was all I did. That was all I had. My friends definitely picked up on things before my parents did because I was spending more time with them, and so anytime a friend would mention it to me, would say that I wasn't eating a lot or that I was being really weird about my food, I automatically would cut them out of my life. The thing about an eating disorder is it's like your dirty little secret. You don't want anyone else to know. Anyone who brings it up to you or tries to confront you about it is automatically a threat to your eating disorder, and you will stop at nothing to protect that. So anytime a friend thought they were trying to help me, I was just pushing them further and further away to the point where I completely isolated myself and didn't see people I was hanging out with for weeks at a time, even months. I wanted more than anything to keep that sense of normalcy with my parents so they didn't pick up on what I was doing. So a lot of times I would go out wearing normal clothes. I would have all of my running gear in my backpack, and then I would go to a public restroom, change, go do my running or my biking or whatever it was, go back and change, and then come home, and my parents would think that I was hanging out with friends when actually I was running till I would puke in the streets. Yeah, if I vomited in the street, that was a good day. That was kind of like the goal, and if I did that, I could go home, but if not, I had to work out more. I was a big calorie counter in the beginning, but as I was consuming less and less food, it kind of seemed futile to actually consume how many calories I was taking in, because no matter what, I was just pushing them out with all the exercise I was doing. I actually had a Thinspo blog, which is basically a Tumblr account that I had where I would repost photos of skinny people so that I was like, that's what I'm gonna look like, or I would vlog different diets people were doing or post progress pictures and stuff like that, and it was super harmful and like 0 out of 10 do not recommend. A lot of my friends found that through my other Tumblr, and so just continually cutting everyone out until it was just me and my exercise and my restricting food. The thing about consuming so little calories to even negative calories most days is you get really hungry. So I began developing a lot of bulimic tendencies where I would binge and purge. Binging is basically like this food frenzy where nothing matters except that you keep eating, and no matter how hard you want to stop or how much you know that this is bad and that you shouldn't be doing this, you just continually keep eating. It's kind of like self-harm in the fact that it's an emotional release because you keep eating and you're indulging in all these good foods and it feels good to eat and feel full. And I know on TV and movies it normally shows a lot of people binging, eating nothing but junk food and candy. I wasn't always like that. I could go days without eating, and as soon as a little bit of food touched my lips, it was like I couldn't stop. And I have so many memories of running around my kitchen in the dead of night, no matter what it was, whether it was a bowl of cereal or grapefruit or an entire bag of chips or half of a watermelon. Like, I would just eat anything I could get in contact with. The images I have of myself just splayed out on my kitchen floor, just sitting there consuming all of this food, is just so disgusting, because no matter what, I remember just thinking, I can only eat. I have to keep eating no matter how bad I know this is and how much I know I'm going to regret it. I just cannot stop eating. And once I'm actually able to stop, I just freeze and I'm like, oh my god, I just consumed everything I eat in like 3 weeks in about 15-20 minutes. So naturally, I'm inclined to purge or to vomit all of those things out. And purging is just another form of emotional release. So like all of these things, they make you feel good for 5 seconds, and then afterwards you just feel absolutely terrible. So I remember going into the basement after all of this, and I would just vomit everything up no matter what it was, and I would not stop until I was confident that everything was out of my system. Laxatives are also a form of purging that I did try for a while, but I always felt like I still had more control over my body when I was able to choose when I wanted to purge. So that was kind of like my niche, was my binging and purging nights, and that would happen at least like once a week, maybe twice every 2 weeks. Like I said, I was underweight before all of this started. I was like an extra small and everything, and throughout this experience I was only buying extra large clothing, even though I had lost even more weight than originally, just because, number one, I was embarrassed of my body and I was so disgusted by the way that I looked that I didn't want anyone else to see what I had underneath there, or even myself. And even though I could not stop myself from losing weight, and that was what I wanted and all I really cared about was getting to my goal weight, I didn't want anyone else to see it, because if they noticed I was losing too much weight, then they would take it away from me. They would make me eat. They would make me go to recovery. And that was my biggest fear. Because so many of my days were negative calorie days where I would be exercising and burning off so many more calories than I was actually consuming, I lost so much weight that I actually lost my period and I didn't have my menstrual cycle for quite a few months. That's a really terrifying thought as a 14-year-old, that you're going to be sterile and never be able to have kids in your entire life. Luckily through recovery it came back, but for a while like I had to just take tampons and throw them out because I didn't want my mom to know that I wasn't getting my period, because then she'd know something was wrong. And over time it just kept getting worse and worse and worse. No matter what I did, it wasn't enough. You know, I wasn't exercising enough. I didn't purge enough after I binged all of that, or I was consuming too many calories and I was eating too much, or I wasn't losing weight fast enough. No matter what it was, I just could not fit these expectations I had for myself. And so my life had just become this cycle of exercise, don't eat, binge, purge, cut. Exercise, don't eat, binge, purge, cut. I distinctly remember one day where I was sitting there, I think I was like on Tumblr or something, and I was just like, why don't I just kill myself already? You know, like no matter what I do, I'm never going to be skinny enough. I'm never going to hit my goal weight. I'm trying so hard and none of this is working. And it's just making me so depressed and it's making me feel worthless. Like, why don't I just end it? And my response to myself was, I can't kill myself yet because I'm not perfect enough to lie in a casket. And it still hurts me that all these years later, that was what my life equated to. All that I cared about in life was reaching my goal weight, and then I could die. You know, as soon as I hit that perfect goal weight and that perfect body, everything else didn't matter and I could finally rest in peace, because that was the only thing that mattered to me. My life was nothing but a number. And as hard as that is for me to recount on, if I ever had an epiphany in my life, that was one. I think immediately after I realized that like that was something that I actually felt and that was something that actually came from my brain, that I knew that I had a problem. It was that point where I was like, I am really sick and I need help or else I'm gonna die. And so from that point was when I decided that I wanted to get better and I wanted to help myself. And so that's not really something you can do on your own. I definitely was able to get myself to eat a few more foods, and I was still entirely restrictive and I still was not eating like a normal person, but I was able to eat a little bit more at every meal and incorporate a few more foods than I had before. And I thought I was making progress and I was going to do really, really good. I'd finally come up to my mom and I had told her, you know, Mom, I just want to let you know I've been struggling these past couple of months and I haven't been eating, but like I'm okay now. Like now that I've told you, we don't have to go any further than this. Like I'm doing really, really good and I'm gonna be fine. And I really thought my mom was just gonna take that and be like, oh sure honey, I know you're okay now. We don't have to worry about it. My mom is an extremely loving and caring individual, and immediately she welcomed me with open arms and was very thankful that I told her because she had noticed it, but she said that I needed to get help. And so that just threw me right back into all of those fears of, no, you can't take this away from me. This is all I have. I want to be anorexic. I don't want to be anything else. Like, this is what I need. I had a doctor's appointment scheduled a few weeks ahead of telling my mom, and she had actually said that if I hadn't told her beforehand, she was going to go to my pediatrician and tell her myself that she was concerned. And so I went into that doctor's appointment very, very scared that my mom was going to talk to my pediatrician. Because like I said, I thought it was fine and that I didn't need help. My mom told my pediatrician, and it was like the world was crashing down. It was the worst thing in the entire world, and I was terrified. I felt so betrayed. I was so angry at my mother for betraying me like that. My doctor and I had talked for a little while, and I had opened up a little bit more to her, and she referred me to an eating disorder treatment center where I would be going to see a social worker and a nutritionist every week. And like most people that go into treatment for eating disorders, even though I knew I was sick and I knew that this was wrong and that I knew I needed help and that if I didn't stop, my disorder would kill me, I did not want to go. I was super reluctant to join recovery at first. There were so many days where I would just sit there and lie to my therapists, and I would come in the next week and be like, nope, I'm not okay. I would spend so many weeks sitting there and be like, oh no, like I'm totally fine, and then I would have a horrific week where I didn't eat, and then I would have to come in the next week and say, I lied. It was super tough. Anyone who thinks that once you join recovery for something, or you know, if you have a drug addiction, when you get to rehab, you're totally fine, that's not how it works at all. The relapses in my first year of recovery were sometimes worse than those actual first spells of anorexia where I was just exercising like crazy and not eating at all. Luckily, I landed an extremely supportive circle of people who cared so much about my well-being, and all they wanted to do was help me. and I am so indebted to these people. 5 years later from mentoring them, I actually still see the same social worker that I started with all those years ago, even though my eating disorder is mostly under control now. She has just had such an impact on my life that I am like forever grateful for. So I'm really glad that I still like have that relationship with her. But yeah, that first year was really, really brutal. I distinctly remember so many weeks when I would not eat anything. Like I used to be able to go a couple of days without eating, but I remember one time I went an entire 7 days without eating and I could not get out of bed. And there were days when I had to stay home from school just because my body was so weak from absolutely no nutrition that I could not move out of bed. And there were a lot of times when I would go through those starvation periods where my mom would, you know, understand what was going on and she would try and like feed me because I couldn't even lift my arms to feed myself in bed. And I would just vomit it back up immediately because my body could not comprehend like what food was because it went so long without it. Truly, truly brutal. And I'm very, very lucky that I've come so far since then. But honestly, like the months of recovery were sometimes so much harder than like anything I had experienced before. To give you a rundown on my actual diagnoses, I was diagnosed with anorexia nervosa, which is like a medical condition, so I fit all of the medical criteria going into it. I had bulimic tendencies because I never really fit the criteria for bulimia because I didn't binge and purge as often as that criterion requires. And I also had an exercise addiction, which is a thing. I know most people don't know that, but exercise addiction is real. It's an actual addiction and it's categorized as an eating disorder. So those were the 3 things that I entered recovery with. Now during my recovery, although my eating disorder was getting more and more under control every day and every relapse was getting spread further and further apart and I was doing so much better, my depression really did come back then. Because the thing is, when you're dealing with an eating disorder, even though you know that you're sick and that you need help and that if you don't get help, you're gonna die from your disorder, you don't want it. For whatever reason, eating disorders have this hold on you where no matter what you do, they are still going to be there. I would be priding myself in doing things like incorporating more foods into my diet or eating more meals or being able to eat in front of people, and then my eating disorder would come at me and say, no, this is wrong, that's disgusting, how dare you do this, look at how much weight you've gained, you are so fat from during recovery, you need to go back to your old ways now. So within all that internal conflict, I started to get really, really depressed again. I had started self-harming as a result of it, and I had started thinking of suicide again, and this was still kind of in the stages where I wasn't always totally open with my therapist, and so I would be fine and I would say nothing was wrong, but I would come back the next week and be like, okay, like I need help. So I never really wrote specifically a suicide note, or never actually planned out my own suicide, but I would just have this journal where I just wrote down thoughts about it. So I wrote down reasons why I wanted to, or like different ways I could do it if I was actually going to plan it out, and like what that last day would look like, and just things like that. And while they are very disturbing thoughts, it wasn't anything serious to me. Long story short, my mom found the journal and got very, very concerned, and so she came into one of my therapy sessions, and my social worker recommended that I go to the nearest psych ward at our nearest hospital. And so immediately I was just sent there, and I had to sit there and get evaluated, and it was scary. I didn't really know what was going to happen from there, as I'd always been involved in outpatient therapy, so I didn't know if I was going to be put in a mental institution. I didn't know if I was going to have to go to a hospital. I was kind of expecting having to be like strapped down to a straitjacket or something of that sort. Luckily, I had just gotten evaluated, and they had just recommended that I go onto antidepressants, so I started taking antidepressants. I had started seeing a psychiatrist because a social worker or a nutritionist can't actually prescribe you drugs. So I had added one more person onto my team of people that were trying to help me recover from this. And at that point, I had been diagnosed with clinical depression, and so they put me on antidepressants. So in addition to going to my therapist and my nutritionist twice a week, I would go to my psychiatrist. I think it was like once every 2 weeks or once every month, just to kind of see how I was doing and see how I was taking the medication. But she never really helped me like my social worker and nutritionist did. It wasn't like talk therapy or anything like that. And so for the most part in the beginning, I didn't actually suffer from any side effects of the antidepressants, which I know happens to a lot of people. I got very lucky in that respect, and it was actually really, really helping. But very, very quickly, things got bad. I can't remember exactly how long I was taking the medication for, but my depression had really gotten under control and my eating disorder was doing a lot better. But nothing ever stops there. So when I believe it was my junior year of high school, I had started, essentially there's no other way to say it, I started hallucinating. It started off with auditory hallucinations where I would just hear very everyday sounds, but they weren't actually there. I would be walking through the hallways at school and I would hear people running up and down the hallways when I was totally alone. I would be in class and I would hear the door slam and it would be wide open. I did have some experience with hearing voices, but it wasn't like what you see on TV where it's like the dog is telling you that you need to kill people or anything like that. It was mostly a lot of inaudible whispering and a lot of name calling in like public places where I knew that like nobody was actually calling me. I think one of the most disruptive auditory hallucinations I dealt with was I was actually very, very close with my health teacher from freshman year, and like I would go after school, and even though I had my social worker and my nutritionist, I would go and I would just talk to her because she really understood and we had a really, really great relationship. But I remember one day after school I was sitting in her classroom and she had gone out of the room for a few minutes, and I heard every single desk in the room flip over onto its back. It was like an absolute like crashing noise, and I turned around and nothing had moved, but it was so real. It was like every sound, every echo I could define, but nothing actually happened. It had gotten so bad that I remember one day I was taking one of my regents, and the way we took it to my school was we would take a regents in a gym with like all of the students, everyone would be in their own desk on the mats, and I heard the rafters falling from the ceiling of the gym, just like falling down and crushing desks and crushing people and all of this noise, and nothing happened. Nothing. The room was still silent. You could only hear the click of the clock, but I heard these rafters falling. I was so terrified that I nearly had to forfeit my exam and just leave right there because I could not deal with it. It was one of the worst experiences of my life to know that I was trapped there for like 2.5 hours just hearing rafters fall and knowing that nothing was happening. And then it got even worse. When I do my public speaking for this in front of like students and parents and whatnot, I tend to leave out a lot of the details, but because I want this to be as open and raw as possible, I'm gonna get graphic, so if violence and gore and just any concepts like that make you uncomfortable, I'm going to suggest you skip over this part and you go to this time frame. So point blank, I started suffering from visual hallucinations as well. And I don't mean visual hallucinations like people take LSD in order to see unicorns and dragons and whatnot. It's not like that. It is a million times worse. I'm honestly embarrassed that I have to talk about this. This is my first time being so full out and open to people that aren't my therapist about this, and it still affects me, so bear with me. The first one I distinctly remember, I was babysitting, and I had been babysitting these 2 little girls for quite a few years, and I was very, very close with them and their parents. And one night I was babysitting them, and we were sitting in their dad's office, and they were sitting on the computer, and for the first time I saw a baseball bat in the corner, and I feel like just instantly like I was just triggered. Something hit in my brain when I saw that baseball bat, and I just went into this like vision of me brutally beating these 2 children I cared so much about and just bashing every part of their body in with this baseball bat. And I just remember the horror of thinking I killed these 2 children, and it ended with me running home in the middle of this, and I didn't know I didn't actually kill them until a week later when their mom texted me to see what time it was coming over at. I spent an entire week of my life thinking I killed 2 children, and it's really, really hard to think about. It was just so real. I felt every inch of it. I saw every little detail, and it wasn't real, and that's when it started. Another really, really distinct one I have is that I was in my English class, and we always had this like fake spear in the corner, I guess because we were talking about Lord of the Flies, and my teacher used it as like a prop to talk about one of the scenes. And again, I saw this spear, and I will never ever forget the image of my teacher's face as I just stabbed her over and over again with this spear. And I blacked out as I did after this. I would black out for a couple of hours. And I remember waking up at home at like 8 p.m. that day when I had class at 10 o'clock. And I sat there and I thought I killed my teacher. And I spent the whole night up and awake thinking that the police were going to come for me and I was going to jail because I killed my teacher. And I went to school the next day and she was there and nothing had happened. And if there was ever a moment where I thought I was going crazy, it was when I was suffering from this. I know I shouldn't be, but I'm honestly so embarrassed and full of shame that like these were things that my mind conjured up, that I actually thought I was brutally murdering people I cared about. And it was just so terrifying that every single time one of these things happened, and those weren't the only 2 occurrences, that I truly believed that this was something that I did, and I did it so violently with just like this calm demeanor on my face, and I never felt any emotion from it until I blacked out and woke up. And it was so hard to deal with. If it sounds scary thinking that you're doing all of these actions and finding out that they're not real, it is. Anyone who watches my channel normally knows that this is not how I normally act, and I'm very scarred emotionally from going through this, and it's just so hard to recount how these things actually looked and felt. And so even after all this time, I still like feel all of these terrible feelings towards it, because it was just so horrible to go through. And so I remember one night when I was babysitting, same kids, so obviously I did not actually kill them, even though every single time I had to see them, that was all I could think of. They had gone to bed, and I was sitting on the couch, and I had called my psychiatrist because I was suffering from an auditory hallucination episode where I thought that I heard footsteps in the house, even though it was only me awake, and I thought people were calling my names. So I was just in a really panicked mode. So I was sitting on the phone with my psychiatrist, and she just point blank asked me, "Are you going to hurt yourself, or are you going to kill yourself because of these voices?" And I was totally honest with her, and I told her, I don't know, because it was getting to the point where I felt like the only way that these things were going to change was if I killed myself, and that was the only way that they were going to leave me alone. And so, you know, she went into regular psychiatrist mode and told me that as soon as I can to get my mom, and my mom should drive me to the hospital, and I should get evaluated again. And so that was what we did. This time I was there for much longer. I had gotten evaluated a lot more. I had taken a lot more tests. I was there for so many more hours, and this is like the middle of the night. And so the end result was that I would have to go to an inpatient facility for some time for them to basically get my medication under control and essentially make sure I didn't actually kill myself. And I went into freak out mode, which is probably the worst thing that I could have done in that situation. I started having a panic attack. I was crying, I was screaming, I was hitting everything. I was just in total panic mode because all I could think was, I have school tomorrow. My boyfriend doesn't know that I'm gonna go into a crazy hospital. Nobody knows what's going on. I have school to do. I have so many things. I don't have my clothes. Like I could not comprehend the fact that I was going to be put away. Which all it did was just reinforce the fact that I needed to go somewhere to be held safe and make sure that I was recovering okay. And so I had to go, and there was nothing that they were gonna let me do to change that. While I've had such a great experience in outpatient therapy, inpatient was like hell for me. It was another one of the most traumatizing experiences of my life. I'd gotten there, and first of all, I did not talk to any therapist, basically. I received actually no counseling. My psychiatrist, who I saw at the very beginning and the very end of my stay, I saw my social worker, who I also only saw once in the beginning. We had one group therapy session in the span of the 3 days that I was there, because they can only hold you there for 72 hours until you're released, either by your parents if you're a minor or by yourself. So in 3 days, I had one group therapy session, and all we did in group therapy was we drew 6 little pictures, and they were of stupid things like our family and our house and what we want to do when we're older, and it did nothing. As I was still in high school and I was in the middle of the semester, I was meant to go to their school, where basically they hand you a textbook and you're supposed to catch up on whatever you're doing in class. And after the first day, I did not go. I stayed in my room and cried for about 3 days straight because it was the most miserable experience of my life. That place was basically a holding cell for teens who were either running away or were threatening to kill themselves. Like, I received no help whatsoever. I'm sitting here going through this psychotic episode, and I'm not receiving any help for that. But basically, they had just kept me there so they could monitor my dosage and change it and see if anything happened. The thing I remember most about it was probably that last meeting I had with my psychiatrist, where basically he told me that I wasn't anorexic because I didn't fit the medical criteria anymore, which makes sense because I had been in recovery for over a year, so I had gained back even more weight than I had before because I was finally eating healthy and normally. I was like ready to stand up and flip the table. I was so angry at this man. Like, how dare he tell me that I'm no longer suffering from my eating disorder just because I've gained back the weight? Like, that doesn't matter that I skipped so many meals while I was there because I was so miserable and I had no desire to eat. Like, he didn't even know that. And like, how dare he tell me? Like, how dare he say that to my face in front of my parents? And at that point, when he walked out of the room, I like flat out told my parents, I was like, I cannot stay here anymore. They knew how miserable I was. Even though I was like an hour and a half away, they came to visit twice a day and just sat there with me while I cried in their arms because all I wanted to do was go home. And it was really, really, really terrible. All I walked out of that hospital with was a diagnosis of schizophreniform, which is basically schizophrenia where you suffer from the symptoms for less than 6 months, because schizophrenia you need to suffer more than 6 months, and there's no decline in functioning. So even though I was suffering from these psychotic episodes, I was still able to go to school and hang out with friends and go to work and do these normal things. Like, it wasn't like I just like had to like trap myself into my house because I couldn't function. So I walked out of there with that diagnosis and this fear that has trailed me until this day, that is not a place I ever want to end up in again. So although that was a horrible, horrible experience and I would never wish the experience I had on my worst enemy, I definitely became a lot more motivated to continue with my recovery from there. I just knew that like I never wanted to end up at that place again. I had met people who had been there like 4 times, and I knew that that was not something I was gonna let happen to me. So that was really the change in the game for me. Luckily, it did do what it was needed to do. It was really, really horrible what I had to go through, but I stopped suffering from those hallucinations and I haven't had an official relapse of my psychosis since. My depression really started improving from there and my eating disorder was much more under control. So I left that place with this motivation to do myself good. And good is what came out of it, even though I will reinforce it was really, really horrible. So like I said, from that experience, my recovery kind of just went on like an upward incline and I was doing really, really well. And although that, you know, I still relapsed and I still had tough days, essentially everything was really under control. I was even able to wean myself off of the medication, and without it, I'm still doing pretty good. A good thing that came from this was I actually started public speaking after that experience. So I was invited by my school to speak at our Human Relations Day. I don't know if this is a common thing, but in my high school at least, every year for one day, we would invite a ton of different visitors to present on different topics, whether it would be a recovering drug addict, disabled people, blind people who used guide dogs, veterans, and people like me who spoke about mental illness. So being able to stand in front of hundreds of people all day long and just sit there and tell my story has not only been amazing because it's been pretty therapeutic for me. It's really nice for me to be able to sit there and talk this all out and get it out into the world and make my story known. It's really, really wonderful for me, but I'm also able to kind of promote other people to start talking about it. Like after every single presentation, I probably do about like 6 a day when I do Human Relations Day, at least one person comes up to me and thanks me for telling my story, and sometimes I'm the first person they open up to about their own story. Or the last time I did it last year, a girl told me that she was an inpatient and she had never met anyone else that was an inpatient, and I've actually walked people to the guidance counselor office to tell someone and take their first steps of getting professional help. So I've been doing that for a while, and that was like the first really great thing that started in my recovery after being an inpatient. So like another great thing came out of it. But like I said, that doesn't mean that everything is perfect. I definitely still relapse even now, although my relapses are a lot different. I think I have a really, really great handle on my depression. I am like a big connoisseur of coping strategies, so things like hooping and YouTube and reading. I know that like when I am feeling depressed, that's where I can go to as an outlet for that, as opposed to harming myself, and so I'm just able to control that so much better than I was in the past. So while there are definitely days where I get very, very overwhelmed with all of the things that are happening in my life and it leads me to feel very depressed, I just have so much of better ways of handling it now that I feel like for the most part my depression for now has at least fairly gone away, and my eating disorder for the most part is under control. I mean, it's still hard for me to look in the mirror and be okay with myself, and that's not something I can ever really plan on going away. With my eating disorder, I kind of just take it day by day, and you know, I'm like, today I'm going to feel good about myself and I'm going to do everything in my power to make myself feel good. Though my relapses for my eating disorder are definitely more frequent than ones like self-harming, but my eating disorder relapses now are less about starvation and more about very, very intense restriction. If for some time I'm feeling very, very overwhelmed with my body and I'm so uncomfortable in it and I start feeling disgusted and I start feeling like I need to lose weight again, I don't necessarily stop eating like I did, and God knows that there are times when my eating disorder has really taken over and I would beg and would do anything for that willpower not to eat back. I don't starve myself anymore, and I haven't had a relapse like that in a really long time. Now my relapses are mainly just being super, super controlling to the point of it being unhealthy over my food. If I'm relapsing from my eating disorder, I have to measure out everything that goes into my body. If it can't be put into a portion size, it doesn't enter my body, and I am super, super adamant about that. Even when I used to work at Chipotle and I would be relapsing, you can't actually make your own lunch. Another Chipotle employee has to make it for you. So I'd sit there at the counter and I would make everyone measure everything out to a T, or I couldn't eat my lunch. And so it was very, very disruptive to everyone around me. I just get very, very obsessive over what enters my body, and I think if there's anything I can really say to describe what anorexia is, it's the sheer panic I feel when I am measuring out my 1 cup of Cheerios for breakfast and I'm afraid that there is 1 extra Cheerio just sitting on the top of that cup that will make me go over in calories, and I'm not able to actually convert it. Like, 1 tiny little Cheerio is my biggest fear sometimes, and I have full-blown panic attacks over it where I can't breathe and I can't see and I can't do anything other than just like lie on the floor crying because I am so terrified of that 1 extra Cheerio that's going to throw off the balance of how much fat's going into my body and how much sodium and how much sugar and how many calories. I get so locked on to 1 tiny, tiny piece of food that probably in the scheme of my nutrition does not matter. That's what it's like to have anorexia. So now my relapses are like that. They're definitely months and months and months apart now, whereas they used to be weeks apart or sometimes only days apart. So I have come such a long way, and even those relapses don't last for a very long time. And I actually do still see that original social worker I started seeing so many years ago when I first entered my eating disorder recovery, so she's always there to help me. And so I have just come so far. It is so strange to think that the person I am today is the same 15-year-old that thought she wasn't perfect enough to kill herself yet. I found love, I have found happiness, I have found a purpose. I'm currently studying psychology at my college so I can hopefully become a clinical mental health counselor and dedicate my life to helping adolescents that have been in the same position as me. There is just so much that I have learned about myself in being able to look at all of those years that I spent in anguish and being able to compare it to how wonderful my life is now. Although mental illness is hard and it's terrible and nobody deserves to go through that, I'm kind of thankful for it in a way. All of those years I spent starving myself and over-exercising and self-harming, they've made me the person I am today, and I wouldn't be who I am without it. I wouldn't be as empathetic as I am. I definitely would not be as passionate as I am. I would not be on this career path. And so although it has been horrible, it has been hard, it has been some of the toughest things I will ever go through in my entire life, they have served their purpose, and I'm thankful for that. I'm in a good place right now, and I'm really happy about that. And while I hate saying I'm fully recovered, I like to think of it as I'm recovering. Every morning I wake up with the intention of making it a better day than it was yesterday. And so no matter what I went through in the past, I am intentionally moving towards the future and making sure that there is a day where I will be able to say that I am recovered. I just personally like to consider myself recovering now, because that way I can't place any expectations on myself other than I'm trying, and I think that's the most I can ask for myself. So this has been a very emotional and important video for me. And although I'm gonna sit in editing and I'm gonna be like, damn, I wish I had mentioned this here, or I can't believe I forgot that, or I don't like the way I said that, I'm never going to be happy with the way I'm telling my story, and I know that for a fact. But I am extremely happy that now I get to tell it in full to you guys. I mean, those of you who follow me on social media, and if you've just been following me this week, you know that this is something that I've gone through, but now you know the whole story. And I'm just really grateful that I've gotten the opportunity to finally tell it to you guys. Even though this video is ending, my story isn't over yet, and yours isn't over either. And if there's one thing that I want you to take away from this video, it's that, as corny and as cliche as it sounds, it gets better. If I had told 14-year-old Emma that in the midst of her anorexia, she would not believe me. But it is just so wonderful to look at how I could be at such a rock bottom and come out on top of the world. And I think more people just need to know that this is survivable, and it's not just survivable, and you're not just gonna come out of this a survivor. You're gonna come out of it living, and you are going to have a happy and fulfilling life ahead of you. And I'm living proof of that. If you have any doubts that no matter what you're going through, no matter how horrible it seems, that you can't make it out of it, I am telling you, you absolutely can. I'm not that good with all these inspirational quotey things, but there's one thing I just want you to take away from this video is that you can move past what you're going through and you're going to reach so many heights that you presently can't even imagine. And I promise you that. Thank you to anyone that listened to my story, that has been keeping up with me this week for Mental Illness Awareness Week, that has been watching my videos for however long. I am just really blessed to have so many wonderful people in my life. And yes, that includes you. If you've ever been touched by mental illness, feel free to leave some of your experience below. Only if you want to. Please don't feel obliged. My ears are always open and I'm always listening and I'm always here to talk to you guys because I understand how important it is to have someone who truly understands what it's like. And I promise you, I do know what it's like. And I do know that things change and things improve and that it's not the end for you. That is it for this video. Thank you guys so much for watching and I will see you soon for a new video. Bye!